Hello, and welcome to another episode of Theater XYZ, a podcast where people from different backgrounds will be talking about issues facing the theater industry today. We're your hosts, Bailey Sheehan,
Elizabeth Miller,
and Matt Faragasso.
We'd like to welcome you to our show. And before we get started, we'd like to take this opportunity to respectfully acknowledge the privilege and complexity of living on the traditional lands of the Lenni Lenape people. We strive to be good stewards of these lands and to resolve the legacies of oppression and domination that have come before and persist today.
Today will be the final episode of the 2020-2021 Reboot the Future podcast series. And while we're talking about moving towards the future, our episode today will be about how and why we should make the theater a more eco-friendly industry.
We'd like to acknowledge that we're all here to learn and discuss, and that as people we can grow and our opinions can change. Nicole Brewer, an anti-racist theater educator, put it perfectly when she said the following: "We must recognize that we are both learning and unlearning. While we are doing that, we are going to create harm. So giving ourselves the grace that allows ourselves to speak in draft, and knowing that that does not define who we are, that it is not the final version of ourselves. This is really important towards forgiveness and building our shame resilience and being able to show up to do this work."
As a newcomer to this, Bailey and Elizabeth have been very green-minded, shall I say, for a long time. And while I've been aware of being more eco-friendly, it doesn't always register with me, let's say, in certain aspects. I know a lot of times I don't connect the dots on like a personal level in terms of transportation or agriculture, industry. Even creating electricity for my house can be bad because I don't always connect those dots either. Like farming is, has all these implications that I don't think of. I think of our dinner. Climate change always felt so far away too, or even still does feel far away. It's like this futuristic problem we're all going to face in 2050 when there's no resources. But the truth is it's happening today, and we're seeing the implications of that. Crazy storms we're having and mudslides and all these things related to a future that is now, that is here.
I think a lot of people think, how can my choices make a difference? And how does that impact anything else that's going on in the world, right? I'm just one person. How am I causing the rise of the oceans or this horrible planet disaster that we have kind of unfolding? One of my favorite ways to illustrate this is to consider the idea of becoming like a vegetarian or a vegan, right? Like as a foodie, and I'm also a vegetarian, I think it's a really great way to illustrate how something so simple can really impact the environment. For instance, according to Susie Amos Cameron, who launched One Meal a Day for the Planet, if you choose to eat just one meal that is plant-based per day for 1 year, you don't even have to become a full vegan or vegetarian full time, just one a day, you can save approximately 200,000 gallons of water. Also, the equivalent, I think it was like a trip from LA to New York, so like 3,000 miles of driving. And that's just one person choosing one meal per day and stepping away from that meat to move toward a vegan lifestyle or a vegetarian lifestyle for that one meal. There's a lot of really bad information out there that kind of leads people away from that kind of choice, or even realizing that has such an impact on the environment. The meat industry and the farming industry are all kind of feeding that sort of narrative. Thank you. That's the right word. The narrative telling us, that it's hard work or it's not accessible, which is just not true. And I think if people did a little research, they'd find that it's a lot easier than they think.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm vegan, and I'm also poor. So if it was more expensive to go vegan, I literally wouldn't be able to do it. And I've saved a ton of money going vegan. I also find it, I do have many privileges, but I find it incredibly easy to be vegan, personally.
Well, and that reminds me of something you've always told me too, I've heard you say numerous times, is people hear, like vegan or vegetarian, and they think it's like an all or nothing kind of situation. Bacon is like the big one, right? Well, I can never give up bacon or whatever. And it's like Bailey has said multiple times, then fine, eat bacon. Like if that's the one thing you hold on to, but you get rid of everything else, like you're still making an impact. And so I think it's that mindset of it's not always all or nothing. It's one meal a day that's plant-based is still making a huge impact. It's just that you have to get your mindset off of, I think, the all or nothing and realize that you can make incremental steps that will have a huge impact later on or, exponentially.
It definitely spreads out as well. I mean, if we think about the butterfly effect of what a single change can make, if I choose to eat one plant-based meal a day for a year and it makes that kind of an impact, just me, myself, think about what would change if 50 people did that or 100 people did that. It would change the landscape of how environmental impact is happening today.
When people think about the environment, they also think about people like me and Elizabeth who are like vegan, vegetarian tree huggers, which we are, in fact, proudly. So what I want to talk about a little bit, and hopefully this can get through, because, you know, like I care about animals a lot, but maybe people don't care about animals, and maybe they care about other people. So when people think of climate change, they think about like, oh, we need to plant more trees, like the trees are dying, or we're killing whales by polluting our oceans. And I think a lot of people don't realize that it absolutely will affect human societies, and it's already affecting so many communities. So I would really love to talk about that and break up the misinformation about that climate change isn't some distant issue. It's a current issue happening now, and it's killing people now. So we're going to bring up some ways about how people will absolutely be harmed by climate change or are already in the process of being harmed by climate change.
Yeah, climate change is leading to hotter, longer summers and more disease. Mosquitoes are very well known spreaders of things: malaria, yellow fever, dengue fever. Where they're going to have longer breeding seasons, so there's going to be more, more plague, more pestilence. Not the word I want, but I think we're already seeing an uptick in these things. With increased water rate, there's increased waterfall, which is going to upset things like water treatment plants, having clean groundwater, which is already a major problem because we already have to filter X amount of, the water. And fresh water is a limited resource, even though you think of how big the oceans are. But again, that's not fresh water. There's already lots of harm being done on water tables and waterfronts.
Yeah, that's a huge one. I had never even thought about spreading disease until we were doing this research. And yeah, they were like, yeah, ticks and mosquitoes that carry, malaria, which is, I think it's the number one death rate globally is malaria. But yeah, I mean, like places that aren't hot are going to be hot, and mosquitoes are going to exist in places that they never existed before. And we don't really have the infrastructure to like deal with that. And yeah, like you just said, fresh water is like really on the decline, and there's all these studies saying that by 2030, so 9 years from now, nearly half of the world's population is going to be living in an area with water stress. And that's not just like, oh, you can't water your lawn every day. That's not what water stress means. Like, you will not have clean drinking water. You will not have the water to do the normal daily things that you do, not just the extra stuff. And that, again, like that's 9 years from now, that's half of the world's population. That could be you, that could be me. It's not just people living in like third world countries. Like we seem to have that idea.
I'm even under the impression too, to kind of go off the hot, longer summers, like even that giant storm that Texas had with the snow was climate related.
Mm-hmm.
So the fact that places are going to be hotter, I think places all over the world are going to see not temperatures necessarily, but like all these natural things happening that they're not used to. Like they got maybe a foot of snow, which is like the Northeast is like, bah, you know what I mean? But like in Texas, that's a huge deal. And it knocked out power grids and people were, freezing to death. And so there was it's just, we're not prepared for those things to happen.
Mm-hmm.
In addition to all the resources that are already limited. So yeah, there's all kinds of trouble to come.
In my research, I was reading about how climate change are going to increase the odds of severe droughts across the United States and other parts of the world. There's a lot of scientific evidence, and this is what I found really, really fascinating. There's a lot of scientific evidence that the flow of atmospheric rivers is being altered by climate change. So it rearranges where the rainfall is and how the rainfall happens and how often and how much. And additionally, we've witnessed more and more widespread wildfires like we saw in Australia, across the West Coast and in other parts of the United States. I remember pulling up a map last year when it was all happening and there were like wildfires, like it looked like the whole United States was on fire. It was nuts. But according to the World Resources Institute, this is part of this climate feedback loop, which means fires are just one piece of the multi-part climate feedback system, and all of which are worsening, fueling more rapid climate change, which is increasing global emissions, which lead to higher temperatures, which then create drier and more fire-prone conditions. With more fires comes more emissions, perpetuating this whole cycle, which is like really scary to me because it feels like we're in this kind of like loop that I don't know how we get off this loop.
Yeah. And there's so many, like, again, there's so many intersections and so many things that are connected that, like, it's like similar to like being in poverty, that like the system just keeps you in this cycle of poverty. Mm-hmm. That's what's happening with the climate right now, is that the things are leading to the other things of droughts are leading to wildfires, which lead to more droughts, which lead to more smoke pollution, which leads to this and that, and that's choking out this area, and then that disrupts the ecosystem. And like it's like a terrifying carousel ride that like no one wants to be on, but no one can get off apparently.
Yeah.
So another, as Matt and Elizabeth just mentioned, natural disasters, of course, they're always going to happen. They're becoming way more frequent and way more intense than was even predicted. Like they knew there was going to be an uptick, but it's actually becoming more of a problem than scientists anticipated. And the big problem with that, in addition to, just disrupting the landscape of the world, is that it's leaving a lot of people stranded, without homes, without resources. And this disproportionately affects women. It disproportionately affects low income communities and Black, Indigenous, people of color globally. This isn't, again, not a third world problem. This is an everywhere problem. And then even when communities are rebuilt, they're not rebuilt in the same way. They're not rebuilt to cater to the people who were originally living there. And it's not just people who are victims of natural disasters, but we have a big problem right now with rising sea levels and ocean acidification. So the people living in coastal communities, they're also suffering from displacement. And again, these aren't problems that will happen. These are problems that are currently happening. And that it's called climate injustice or environmental racism. If those are two words that you want to look up, that's what it's called. And this happens in New York City, for example. There's really cheap housing around bus depots that leads to an area with a higher rate of air pollutants, which leads to higher rates of asthma, which leads to higher rates of respiratory issues. Another example is that the number one weather-related cause of death is heat, like things like heat stroke, or if you already have any health issues, they just get exacerbated because of the heat. And people of a lower income area are less likely to have heat adaptive features, such as like air conditioning. And even if you do have an air conditioning unit, can you pay your electricity bill when there's surge pricing when it's hot? If it's really cold, there's surge pricing for your heat. Like if you are of a lower income background, like that's the risk you take of, am I going to freeze to death or am I going to be in complete financial disarray? I mean, that's like a real problem that a lot of people face. And the most frustrating thing for me is that marginalized and disenfranchised people are significantly less responsible for climate change because climate change is a direct result of consumption culture and capitalism, to which they play the least amount of part in.
A rabbit hole.
It's so frustrating. Yeah. I know. I get told all the time that like, oh, how could you care about the environment when there's like all these people dying and it's all related and I want to shake people all the time.
Well, that goes back to something that you've said too. We're almost over the part of like trying to tell people and trying to get them to believe it's a thing. And we just have to, like, those who are acting because it is a thing, right? There's no more like, oh, hey, believe me. It's like things are happening because they need to. So we're doing it. We're making it happen. It's either like get on or get out of the way.
I think that happens with a lot of social justice issues, or it's starting to happen, thankfully, not just climate change, where people are just kind of like, you know what? I'm just going to keep going because I don't need you to listen to me. I'm just going to start working on it myself and taking that action, which is super exciting to see. So just bringing us back to the points that you were talking about where, the most disenfranchised folks are being moved further away, or the lower income folks are being moved away from access to fresh and affordable food and decent healthcare options, like when there's a natural disaster that occurs and it disrupts that neighborhood. And then there's like this funds that come in to do the rebuilding. It leads to gentrification, right? Naturally, it pushes people further out and away from those resources that they desperately need. So this is actually a term called climate gentrification, if you want to look that up. It is, there's a great article that describes it as what's happening in neighborhoods, not only that are being disenfranchised by natural disasters and kind of the reclaiming of those spaces by gentrification efforts when they rebuild, but also areas that are traditionally overlooked by wealthy people are becoming more attractive, right? And so they sort of move in, and then it kind of raises the price of the land and the housing and the resources that are there. And then folks who are on a lower income are shoved and boxed into areas that are maybe over-inhabited, or there's far fewer resources to go around, which causes other issues.
Yeah, and with disasters, mudslides, rising sea levels, land is going to go away. Land is going away, which is going to lead to global conflict because the people in smaller geographic areas with fewer resources, they're going to start fighting over all these resources. And 2014, the U.S. Department of Defense is the threat of climate change is declared as a very serious national security. again, this is already happening, right? Natural disasters are leading to people who need different places to live, who are leading to gentrification, which is leading to fighting over all these resources. So this is just one of those big loops, right? Where do we start? Do we talk about pollution? Do we talk whatever? It's all there, right? And it's leading to all these other problems, which is leading to more death anyway. So
Yeah, I mean, we've seen it 1,000 times. There's people can be incredibly greedy. If there's 50 people in a room and they're saying there's enough water for 20 of them, like the first human reaction, I mean, we are animals. It's to fight for your resource and to fight to keep yourself alive. When it gets really touch and go like that, I mean, if we can get to it ahead of time, if we can anticipate the problems, then sure, there could be some sort of like government distribution and things like that. But I mean, people are absolutely going to die when there's not enough resources. Like there's really no way of like dancing around that people are dying due to lack of resources, and they will continue to do so as the resources diminish.
Right. If we live in a world now where there are the resources there are, and there are people who still die or have, poor quality of life due to insufficient resources, what's going to happen as those pools get smaller, right? They're not getting bigger. So we already live in a world where this is already the truth. And then we're going to take away from all that. We're not addressing that. We're not worried about that.
Yeah, and right now, climate refugees, they aren't a protected class, which is really interesting. So if you are a refugee fleeing like genocide or persecution or war, you are an internationally recognized group. You have like all these safeguards to help you. And climate refugees don't have that. So if you're someone who is fleeing natural disasters, if you lost your home, there's nothing protecting you. You're just seen as like a tourist like everyone else, which is so fascinating to me. There are laws that are changing that now that that's becoming more of a
thing.
A thing people care about. But yeah, as of right now, they're not. Climate refugees aren't internationally recognized.
And that's not something I would have ever thought of or think of, right? That there are natural disaster refugees.
That really surprises me. I think most folks probably would think, oh, well, the Red Cross is going to take care of them, or, some other organization in line with that.
So the last point I want to bring up about why it matters, why here, like all the unexpected ways that climate change is affecting people every day. And one of the ones that makes me the saddest is the mass extinction of land and water animals. Hundreds of species go extinct every single day, some that we haven't ever even discovered, some that we don't know how they play a role in their food chain and their ecosystem. And that's really what it comes down to. It's not just about an animal dying out. What mass extinction is telling us is that the ecosystem is collapsing, which again, everything's connected. It's not just animals dying out. It's animals dying out that eat other animals that eat the plants. So now, and there's some areas where the one animal that ate a whole bunch of plants is dead now. So then these plants are taking over and disrupting the ecosystem that way. There are situations where we have too many prey animals and not enough predator animals. Like there's a big issue with that in Yellowstone National Park with the deer, and they had to re-release wolves. And it completely like fixed the ecosystem because that's how it's supposed to happen. So even if we take out all the animals that people unnecessarily eat, which is all of them, by the way, it causes disruption.
I feel attacked. No.
You should. There are birds and there are insects going extinct, which means that we won't be able to pollinate our crops anymore, which means that we don't have our vegetables or our fruit either because they're not pollinated because there's nothing to pollinate them. Additionally, we way overfish our oceans, a disgusting amount of overfishing of our oceans. The coral reefs are dying. And that is leading to the acidification. It also are animals like oysters that purify the water for the other animals and plants that live in the ocean. And the more we get rid of those, the less pure the water is. So even though salt water is undrinkable for us, like that's another creature's habitat. And it's going to just keep leading to more and more collapse. We still get a lot of medicinal compounds from nature. And if we can't get those anymore, there's going to be medicines that we like literally can't access because like not all medicine is like made at a factory. Like they have to get the product from somewhere, which is it's terrifying. It's absolutely terrifying. And again, this chain reaction, this butterfly effect that we don't even see, over hunting wolves in one area made the actual course of the river in Yellowstone National Park change, which is interesting. There's a really cool documentary about it because the wolves were eating the deer and the deer were eating the plants that grew alongside the river. So then the deer were overeating the plants, which led the banks of the shores collapse because there wasn't the root systems to hold them up. It's a really cool documentary. And we've said it before. I'm going to say it again. Animal agriculture is a huge detriment to climate change. They have to deforest. Most of the Amazon rainforest is deforested to feed the livestock. So all that land that are literally the lungs of the earth, or if they're going to be deforested to grow more food for humans, no, it's food grown to make take other people's food, the immense land needed to contain the livestock, transportation from the farm to the slaughterhouse, because they're not always the same location, from the slaughterhouse to the packaging site, not always the same location, from the packaging to the store, to the methane and the emissions put out by the animals. Communities that live near animal agriculture plants have huge issues with polluted water runoff from the animals. While going vegetarian is better, the dairy and egg industry are incredibly problematic in terms of deforestation, transportation, emissions, and they do hold the animals longer. And watch Dominion if you want to know why. Slaughterhouses and all these industries are not good. And I truly believe if you cannot sit through Dominion, you do not deserve to eat meat. If you can't watch an animal being slaughtered, you don't deserve to eat that animal. But we've said it before. We're going to talk about culture shift in a minute, since that's how we're going to make a change. If you have the ability to do so, give it a shot. Try being vegan. Try being vegetarian. Try replacing a couple meals a day, a couple meals a week even. It took a lot of little steps over a long period of time that brought us to this mess of climate change. And I do think it's going to take really big steps over a short period of time to get us out. For me personally, like I said, it's cheaper for me to be vegan than when I was eating meat. And I have the privilege of not living in a food desert. I have the privilege of owning a car, but every single grocery store I've been to in the past 4 years has vegan items. So you'd really be surprised if you just take a look around your grocery store. Tofu's delicious. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise.
Yeah, you can hit us up recipes.
Right, we should put that on Instagram, right? We'll put recipes up or something. Like, let's break that mentality of, oh, I have to be a vegan or a vegetarian 100%. It's these little steps that will get you there. Will get us there as a community as well. So it's not always these big grandiose acts that you have to do to make change. It's those little everyday things. And if you can be consistent with those little things, you'll see change.
Yeah, I'm just going to say it one more time. 1 plant meal a day for 1 year, 200,000 gallons of water, and 3,000 miles of emissions. That's one person's impact.
And that's crazy to me that those are the numbers. In today's world, something that we're kind of ingrained with is consumption and capitalism. And I'm going to add immediate gratification as well. And, my primary example, Amazon. Everything is next day, same day. When I go on and I buy something, I'm not thinking, oh, this has to get from here to there, emissions. I want my pencil holder tomorrow, right? So I'm going to order it on Amazon and damn the cost. That's the problem, right? A little bit is, do you need things next day? Do you need them from Amazon? Is it worth locally sourcing, going to the secondhand shop down the road? But even if you go down the store, find somebody in your community who does crafts or is like a carpenter or woodworks, you're supporting local business, local people. There aren't jet planes flying and trucks. Again, it's one little decision that is having that bigger impact on the butterfly effect.
Yeah, and if I just want to add to that really quickly too, is that a lot of times people think that it's all corporations' fault and that we don't have any individual responsibility to fix that. But businesses like Amazon and other megacorps and other industries are fulfilling supply and demand, and they are supplying the products we want at the price point we want them for, at the speed rate that we want it. So if we didn't demand this type of product really cheap to get here in 2 days, they wouldn't be taking the shortcuts that they're taking that are contributing to climate change. So you do have individual responsibility in what corporations are doing.
I think it's about like that conscious decision and that commitment to making that choice. That's the hard work of changing the culture and changing the pattern of our thinking. Some other options that I've taken on, I recently added a solar array to my property. Also in the last few years, purchased a used electric car. And both of those choices were really conscious decisions. A lot of people are like, well, how far can you possibly get in an electric car, And when I tell them that it has a 90-mile range, they're like, oh, well, that seems really lame. Like, you can't go on trips with it. It's like, well, yeah, but it's perfect for around town, which is where I travel the most. So the impact is actually pretty great. It's to just put it kind of in the forefront of your mind and say, well, today I'm going to go shop at this local store rather than order it from Amazon, or making that new decision.
Yeah, and everything's hard when you start. I mean, like, think about how many times people have jumped on like a new workout routine or like a new diet. Matt, I'm looking at you.
That's crazy.
People always say like, oh, do something for 21 days and it becomes a thing. Like, just try something for a while and it's going to be hard. So I've been vegan for almost 4 years now. And was it hard when I first went vegan? Sure. Would I say it's hard now? Absolutely not, because a lot of it is just about disrupting misinformation. That was the biggest thing for me, is that like I thought I'm not going to be able to eat anywhere. And I live in the Lehigh Valley, which luckily is super vegan friendly. Almost all the restaurants have vegan options. So I do acknowledge that that also is a privilege. I do a lot of zero waste things. I use like reusable paper towels, and I buy bamboo toilet paper, and I have a bidet and all these other things. Were all those things hard at first? Sure. Making sure I'm like making the right choice, or, you know, sometimes you do just want to like grab a paper towel to clean up something and you're like, oh, wait, I can't do that now. It's hard until it's not. And then it just becomes a normal part of your everyday life. So really like starting is the hardest part. Like anything in life, really.
Yeah, it's kind of breaking free of that what we've always done mentality. And we got off that carousel long enough to go, okay, well, is there a different way to approach this? Or is there a different place I can buy this? Or is there a different way I can make this choice?
Mm-hmm.
Right. And I also want to acknowledge that my privileged position has allowed me to make those choices of, you know, having a solar array and all of that stuff.
We as a group are going to try and tie this back into theater.
What? Is this a theater
Right,
podcast?
right. Let's.
Oh, I thought this was about veganism.
Yeah.
Welcome to Vegan Eating this week. What can we do as theater makers, as theater goers? We still have a responsibility, right? We've talked about all these little things people can do in their everyday lives to be more eco-friendly or eco-conscious, and theater is the same thing. One of the big things is we have a platform, right? So artists can write shows and do works about being eco-conscious, and one of the big things I think too is to create empathy. That's what theater's all about, empathy, right? But if you can tell a story, or you can make the characters, or you can make an audience who isn't always thinking these thoughts, like me. Like these aren't thoughts I have every day. I don't make these active choices. Hopefully that will change now that all this research has been brought to my attention. But if you can make people who aren't immersed in this care about other people or other individuals or even your characters, I think that's a huge step in helping shape that conversation. Is how do we make a wider audience empathetic with these situations or these people? I think it speaks volumes because artists are how do I want to say this? They are speakers of the time, right? Like they are very aware of what's going on, and they are the ones who talk about it, I think, the most. They have that platform, they write, they do plays, whatever it is, but they reflect society. And so I think it's maybe easy is the wrong word, but I think you can find shows. I know Liz Duffy Adams is a huge one, and I know that because she came to Lehigh, but I'm sure they're out there.
Another way that theater is a really great vehicle for talking about climate change is that people aren't talking about it. There's some study, and it's like 85% of people like are afraid of climate change and they know it's a problem, but only it's like 18% talk to their friends and family about it. And the great thing about theater is that, you know, you go see a show and you talk about the show after. It's not like you go see a show with your friends and then you're like, okay, that was cool, bye, and like walk away. Like people always talk about it. So theater really inspires that dialogue, because I'm not sure if it's fear or guilt or not really knowing where to start the conversation about climate change. But if you do a show about it, you know, if it's a show about it, great, then that talks about direct issues. But maybe you can see how a theater is making a change. Like, oh, all their costumes were from their stock or borrowed or thrifted. I can do that with my wardrobe. You can inspire changes in that way too. You know, this character did everything right and they still lost their home to rising seawater. That wasn't their fault at all. And maybe they can see that they can't just sit back and wait for other people to care about climate change. They can care about climate change and they can act on their care about climate change. You know, we can reach people in ways that like newspaper headlines or statistics or reports can't, because of what Matt was saying about empathy. And just like our recent episode on whether or not theater makers have an obligation to address social justice issues, shout out to another episode. Greener productions have a few ways of manifesting themselves. You have to start in your own house first. That is like baseline. This is what you need to do. You can't and shouldn't do shows about sustainability and climate change if your theater actively works against those practices. You know, if you're doing a show about like pollution and waste and you're carving your set out of bead foam and purchasing all new costumes that come in plastic bags, like that's terrible. It's ingenuine, it's shallow, and it's fake, and people will see right through it.
As we focus on changing the culture and move toward abandoning those old comfortable habits and practices and outdated policies, I think a lot of folks are going to become discouraged because it doesn't always yield immediate results. So we also have to remind ourselves that this work is going to take time to develop and that we need to find the right balance that works for everybody. So as we learned in our episode on work-life balance, sometimes change can start with asking the right questions, but it doesn't stop there. We want to remember to take action every day. We want to take action and constantly follow up on those important questions to help create that change in the culture. So for instance, we might set a 10-year goal to enact more green policies like you were just mentioning, Bailey. And when we start with the first of those many steps toward that goal and we're super energized by it, it's going to be really exciting. But then it sort of falls to the wayside, or the growth seems imperceptible and we're like getting really frustrated because it doesn't feel like we're getting anywhere. That's when it's really important to constantly remind ourselves that this is a marathon and not a sprint, and that we're in it for the long haul. So as time passes and these changes are going to occur, and we just have to trust the process, if we stay committed, then eventually those goals will get met, right? And we'll get to where we want to get.
Yeah, and a big way that a lot of these theaters are setting goals like this is they're reinvesting in people and labor instead of in supplies. So they're using more labor to create things instead of just purchasing it from Amazon or Home Depot and taking the time to create. The Climate Justice Action created this movement called the Just Transition, which unifies the labor movement with the environmental movement and really centers voices on healing and regenerating community people alongside of the planet, and it addresses a lot of past harms that hurt both people and the planet. Some of their principles center on equitable redistribution of power, building what we need for right now, which is kind of what Elizabeth was saying, that like these baby steps, they address what the now problems are, and then they raise the bar again and address that next goal. And then they also really focus on that the rights of people's communities and nature must supersede the rights of the individual.
There's an organization Bailey made me aware of called the Broadway Green Alliance, which to my surprise was started in 2008. Good for them. Fantastic. And it's huge. Like if you go to their website, which I'm sure we'll supply, they have half a dozen links on how to educate yourself, from reopening greener to closing green, and touring. Like how do you tour green? And I thought that was fantastic. They have programs, including the binder program, which is where they collect and lend 3-ring binders to the general theater community. So if you have binders, you drop them off. If you need them, you go pick them up. And it's just a way it's one of the R's we'll get to later. So we call it teaser in the industry, right? They're reusing and these 3-ring binders to prevent trashing them. So they just have great resources and great ideas. Even if you're not a theater maker, I would check it out. There's a lot of really good information on that website.
And from those great ideas come more great ideas. So we can start with some fairly simple changes, like moving away from the practice of printing everything, which drives me crazy when I see people doing that, or creating a digital script on a computer or a phone or on your tablet. The changes also can include things like banning non-reusable water bottles or providing reusable cutlery or plates. You can also request vegan meals in contracts. If you want to green up on tours and stuff, just doing that kind of research to find what's going to work for your theater and your practices as you develop these new ways of working.
I'm super inspired by Barnard College. They decided that they wanted their theater department to be greener. So they set this goal and they really put it in action. They did an audit of their stock and they had an external company come in and do an audit. So they build using their stock scenery and props and costumes into their season selection. And if they do have to buy new materials, they kind of think about it in the long run of okay, it's not just a matter of buying this prop, but can we use it in the future? We're going to audit if we buy it new. We're going to audit if we buy it from a thrift store. We're going to, if we have to drive to a rental house to pick it up, what does that say about our emissions? So it's not just budgeting finances. They budget their carbon emissions and their impact in the environment alongside their financial thing. And my favorite thing that they do is that they hold themselves publicly accountable. So in the backs of their programs, they will post what percentage of it is pulled from stock, what percentage was purchased, and what percentage was borrowed or something. That way everyone can see oh, our costume shop did really good last show, but this show we bought a ton of new things. How can we do better? And they can kind of map their trends. And it's not even about posting their failures. It's a journey. So they're posting the steps along their journey and what they learned. Why did we buy all new costumes for this show? Did we not have it in stock? Was there no one we could borrow it from? Did we not plan enough time in the season for this show? So they have a really awesome framework. You can find it on their website. And they were also part of, I want to say American Theater, but that's not the right one. We'll put the resource in the thing so you can see if you're a university, if you're trying to budget for a university, you can see what they did.
I love that. I love that that they've taken it to such a transparent level. It sounds like they're really creating an amazing culture. I love the idea that they recognize that they're not going to do perfect every time, right? Which is kind of where we get locked into that idea of perfectionism, which is a tenet of white supremacy culture, right? Is that whole thinking of perfectionism and that we have to do it right the first time. But allowing for that ability to make mistakes is really important and critical to that growth. That's super exciting. I love that they're kind of kind of creating their own loop. And also, instead of like doing the loop of climate disaster, they're like the loop of climate change, like response and growth. I love that. There's so many great organizations putting out resources also, such as the Green Production Guide, the Greener Reopening Toolkit, and the Sustainable Theater Practice Treaty. Like Bailey already mentioned, I think Matt already mentioned it. I'm going to say it too. We'll be putting a resource guide together inspired by all of these.
Yeah, and just to go back a quick second. Yeah, this whole fear of failure, like, it upsets me. there's no need for it. You learn from failure. You can move forward from failure. Why are we all so afraid to fail? Just be accountable, right? We didn't do this. We did that. We can do better. It's giving ourselves and even entities that grace that we talked about in the beginning of this podcast. Like, we're not done yet, and that's okay. However, if you are a bigger theater or a regional theater, like the next logical step now is to divest from fossil fuels and sponsors that are tied to that. And for you naysayers who are like, that's never going to happen, it happened with big tobacco. We just have to remember that it's not unheard of, that these things are possible. It's those little steps. It's being committed to the process and the change.
Especially with things like that are hard, you have to remember who's being harmed by you doing that. If you need to remind yourselves of why these things matter, it's not just about saving the whales, it's about saving your community. So if you're involved in theater, you probably have heard of a dramaturg, shout out to Maddie Parada from our episode on accessibility, who's a person who helps dig out like subtext and helps contextualize the world of the play through research. But a lot of theaters are now introducing our greenaturg, and ecoturgy.
I like those words. Those are fun.
And they find like the environmental research in the canon of a show, and then they relate it back. So they do this by asking 4 questions. What is the broader environment of our work, whether manifested on stage or not? What are the parallels between the natural world of the play and where the play is being produced? What are the environmental impacts of the choices made by characters, intentional, anticipated, or otherwise? And what are the connections, literal and metaphorical, between the natural world of our plays, the various natural worlds of our audience? So that's like a really interesting position that places are implementing to get like their plays greener, whether they're focused on climate or not.
You know, you might be familiar with the 3 R's: reduce, reuse, and recycle. We are developing that out into what is called the 7 R's, which stand for refuse, reduce, reuse, recycle, rethink, reimagine, and regenerate.
We used to have a guy who worked at Lehigh. We all had our coffee in our pods. We had these boxes, which you would put the pod in, and you get a tree out of all these old coffee grounds. And I was like, that's so exciting. And he's like, yeah, we're all recycling and whatever. And he's like, but no one's thinking about the other R. And I was like, what? He's like, the first one is like reduce. He's like, we shouldn't even be using this many pods. And I was like, oh, again, this is right, me, the outsider. But it's those little moments, right, where you have these aha moments in life.
If you want to get really sad about climate change, you should look into recycling and how most of it ends up in landfills anyway, because people don't know how to properly recycle.
My girlfriend works with like 3-year-olds she teaches how to recycle. She's like, it's not that hard. 3-year-olds can do it.
Yeah. Reduce, reuse, recycle. That's the order that they need to go. And recycling should be the last step that you do. You should refuse things first. And like, if you have no other choice, then recycle. But that should be the last step.
I really like rethinking or reimagining how we're doing stuff. That's where that kind of taking action part comes in. It's like you want to stop yourself before you make that decision or make that choice and rethink your approach to it.
Superhero Clubhouse has an eco-theater manifesto. In summary, that eco-theater is holistic, based on healing and regenerating, diverse and intersectional, complex but accountable and compassionate, and that the eco-theater is hopeful and centers on resilience and dedication to do better.
So after you start in your own house, your theater's on the path to becoming green. How do you do more? You've reduced, you've reused, you've recycled. So the next thing you can do is do shows that are specifically about or centered on climate change and climate justice. So there's the Climate Change Theater Action Festival. I just want to shout out as a really amazing opportunity. And essentially what they do is every other year they commission 50 playwrights to write some short plays about climate change. And then they provide these plays completely free of charge to be produced from September to December. So what you do as a theater is you do any amount of these plays. Sometimes people do all 50, sometimes people do like 10, and you could do a simple reading, you could do a full production, people perform them like on the tops of mountains or in kayaks and like really cool site-specific work. And then most importantly, is you pair your production with an action. So some people have done electronic recycling drives. Other times they've written like scripts on different issues to call your local government officials about. And then someone did a vegan soup kitchen event, which I love because it's not enough to talk about or perform a piece. You actually have to act and follow through on it.
Yeah, and you really want to make sure that you tailor it to your audience, what's going on in your own backyard, right? So if I was in California, maybe I would want to do one that was addressing the issue of wildfires and droughts and other issues that are happening out there. Or perhaps if I was in New Jersey, I'd be thinking about coastal depletion and making sure that I address issues that line up with what's happening locally. You know, if I was in Yellowstone, I might do one on why wolves are so important to the ecosystem.
Yeah, it also really helps your audience connect, you know, if they care about their community, which leads to this really cool program I want to talk about. And this kind of jumps to our next one about doing shows that kind of have like a backdrop of climate change. So there's this thing called ecosonography, which basically is like integrating like the awareness that no decision stands on its own. Every choice is intertwined with social, environmental, economic, and political consequences in with your design of your show. The woman who had kind of coined the term, she did a show called The Living Stage. And what she did was she found this kind of underutilized neighborhood in New York City and turned it into a community garden as part of a performance piece. So they had like food demonstrations and gardening demonstrations with people in character in addition to their performances. And they went into this community and were like, here's the space, we're going to like get you started. And now it's still a community space, even though the production has left like many years ago. So by making people like care about their space and show them that there is hope, they completely transformed this area. And then they did another production where it was a community cleanup as a performance.
That's really cool.
Yeah.
That is, and it goes to that, it's still that whole practice what you preach. Good on them for doing that. That's awesome. I mentioned Liz Duffy Adams before. I'm going to mention her again. She is a playwright, and we did 2 at Lehigh, Dog Act, and then we did The Broken Machine, which I believe was commissioned for Lehigh. The show isn't necessarily about climate change. Like, we're living in this moment now where we need to make all these decisions, and like this is the precipice of disaster. Her shows are all kind of after that point, right? Where the action is all happening in this post world where this is just part of the world. This is what it is. It's barren, it's full of trash, it's full of plastic bags, wildfires are everywhere, which I think is a great way to do what she does. So they're not super preachy, because in the moment it's not like this is about climate change and we need to do all these. It's more about this is the world these people live in. Hey, this could be us. Mm-hmm. I think that's a really great way and that she does what she does.
When theater is able to create this story like Liz did with Broken Machine, it was really that immersive experience of, oh shit, the world's on fire. It had that huge impact, and it kind of sparks that idea, I hope, in the audience to take that stop and do a personal reflection about what choices we're making and where these choices are kind of leading us down to, right? It urges our audiences to look within and re-examine the choices that we're making, which might be leading to catastrophic world disaster, right? Where we all die because the world's on fire. So when we take those risks, it opens those doors to that vulnerable space. It really humanizes the story, and that impact can be really great. We can awaken the force of change and potentially spark a commitment to that change. Just one audience member at a time. 200,000 gallons of water. Remember that?
Right, yeah.
Like we've said a bunch of times, we live in this really harmful capitalistic commodifying consumption culture that only the people at the top are really benefiting from. So even if you do works that are breaking that mold, and those are works against capitalism, against commodity, against consumption, that will indirectly lead to benefits in climate change. There's this really, really cool theater called Open Flame Theater, and their mission statement is, we believe in the need to evolve and grow beyond a culture that turns the world into commodities, because the inevitable consequence is that we commodify and objectify ourselves. And that like hit such a chord in me, because we do see each other and the world and the planet right now as the utility we can get from it and what value we can see. You know, it's not like looking at an empty field being like, I wonder what animals live there. It's like, I'm a plop a McDonald's right there. And when we stop seeing the planet and each other and ourselves by what we can profit from, like the world is going to improve immensely.
Excuse me. Can we leave that in? No. I'm going to talk now. Okay, right. We all know that corporations and government actions will be needed to undo what's been done and to get on board with this. But that doesn't mean that as individuals that we're not responsible as well, especially when it comes to government. The government, in theory, works for us. You need to tell government what it is you want, what it is you need, what it is you think your tax money should be spent on, who you vote for. These are all ways to make sure the government is doing what you want it to do, and hopefully spending your money the way you want it to be spent. And with big corporations too, like we kind of said that, Amazon exists because the demand for it exists. And if we could cut the demand for it, it wouldn't exist. So, make sure that you're kind of putting your money where your mouth is, right? And that's something I need to do better with, because I know I will be the first person to throw Jeff Bezos under a bus, but I'm also the first person to shop on Amazon. So you need to make sure that what you're doing and what you're saying align. Speak with your wallet, right? If you hold out the money and you change the demand, hopefully who's supplying the demand will shift, and that will help with our overall goal. But also as theater makers, again, where are we getting our lumber? Is it locally sourced? Is it sustainably sourced? Can we hire a woodmaker to make us a prop? Is there time for that? Is there budget for that? We all know that we need the government and corporations to act as well. That doesn't absolve you. The whole show we've spent saying how one decision from one person impacts all these other areas of the world. So you're not off the hook. That's all I'm saying.
Now, I've been a crunchy, chewy, tree hugging eco warrior for most of my life. And through the years, my commitment to this eco lifestyle has waxed and waned, especially as a working mom. When my kids were really young and that easy or faster option was like, that's the best way I'm going to have like any sanity in this moment, if I can just the quickest option to make them happy. But I find that if you make the effort and stay committed, chances are you're doing pretty good. As a recovering perfectionist, one of my favorite quotes is to be gentle with yourself because you're doing the best that you can. And for me, this has been really important to remember because it allows me to make those mistakes as I grow.
It can be really hard when you work for something that doesn't always align with your values. Theater's an incredibly wasteful industry, and there's so much more that we can be doing. And a lot of theaters are just starting to get on board with greening themselves up. So for all the other crunchy granola people out there, like I get it. I suffer from extreme environmental anxiety. I am stressed about the environment all day, every day. I'm always thinking about it. There's never a time I'm not thinking about the planet. And that guilt can be really crushing. It's really hard to be hopeful, but that is the most important thing we can do. I've asked the cashier 3 times not to hand me a plastic bag, and they put everything in a plastic bag and hand it to me. And I feel guilty about that for the rest of the day. It was completely out of my control. And there are lots of recycling programs for plastic bags, but it's constantly on my mind of like how to do better and be better and make another change or find another zero waste option or convince this person to be vegan. And it's exhausting. So I do want to echo what Elizabeth said about like, you need to take that time for personal sustainability. For me, I really struggle to find a balance of holding myself accountable when I have less control over the environment at work. As a scenic charge and a props person, when directors want that prop in 2 days from Amazon, like how do you fight that? How do you enact that culture shift at your job? And it's hard. I personally think I have benefited a lot from being hard on myself, and that's not the same for everyone. Some people like need to be easier on themselves, but for my personal accountability, I have to be hard on myself because it is a marathon and not a sprint. But we do have to keep running. This is not a walk around the block. It's a marathon. You have to keep running. You have to keep digging deep and finding it because sitting around doing nothing is how we're here. So we have to act in order to change it. There's this really good quote from an article of how object puppetry confronts climate change. And the quote is, if climate change is a result of our cultural values, then it follows that we can fight it by reevaluating those values, by championing the future over the present, the givers over the takers, and the collective over the individual. Once an audience accepts this, they can begin to undermine the prevalent assumption that humans are the inalienable protagonists of the story of planet Earth. We want people to feel energized, to be reminded of what we're fighting for. We don't want audiences to feel judged or that we are somewhat holier than they for caring about these things. To that end, we are trying to set impossible goals with the likelihood that we will fail miserably and publicly. Which I love because we are going to fail. We're going to mess up, but we need to stay hopeful and stay diligent. And when we do fail, like you just have to pick up and keep going because there isn't an alternative.
Yeah, absolutely right. Absolutely right. Just keep moving forward.
And that reminds me of something I've seen, I think tailored more toward like the workout area, but it's like, you get results by being consistent. It says like, today was an A, yesterday was an A, tomorrow's an A, okay, but the day after is an F, and the next day's an A, and then there's a B, and there's a C in there somewhere. And so it's not always about being perfect and doing everything absolutely right all the time. It's that it's a consistent, dedicated effort, and you just gotta keep doing it.
So what are you going to do, Matt, as the
Oh,
person
man.
without the green mind? What are you going to do, huh? What's your day one?
This was eye-opening in a lot of ways. Some of those numbers that were thrown out there, like changing the one meal a day, how much it changes exhaust or water, and some of the mindset of fields out there for food, just for food, and there's water, and there's all these resources that are going to feed something that I'm going to eat at some point down the line, and all the steps it takes to get there. And honestly, the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to check out all those videos on Broadway Green Alliance. So thank you for sharing that with me, and thank you for the numbers. And
what's your vegetarian meal a day going to be, Matt?
Good question. It's basically eggplant parmesan, right? But you cut the eggplant and you layer it, you put cheese and sauce in there, and it's like a lasagna. I was eating that for like days, and I was like, oh, I haven't had any meat lately. And I completely didn't even think that, like, I'm just eating eggplant. So I think the next biggest step for me, honestly, is going to be, I'd love to change my eating habits. I think that's the most immediate, biggest thing I can do for myself and for the environment that I have the most control over.
What's really interesting is I am vegan as an indirect relation to Matt because I went vegan after I started working at a vegan bakery.
You're welcome.
And I wouldn't have known about that vegan bakery had Matt not brought me to that vegan bakery my first week in the Lehigh Valley.
I was like, yeah, I'll show you a cool place. Come to this bakery that is fantastic and vegan. And I remember you being like, oh yeah, I've done vegan before. I can just do it. And I'm like, you can just do it? What? And like, I swear, like one day you were like, I'm going to be vegan, and you've never looked back. So
yeah, I did do it overnight. That's not how most people do it. And like, if you can't do it overnight, I'm one of those people that like, when I have an idea in my head, I'm like, here we go. But it's because of Matt that happened. It's funny.
That is funny.
Now we're going to return the favor.
Next thing you know, I'm going to be vegan, although that's not going to happen overnight. That's not gonna... Baby steps, one day at a time. We want to thank all of our listeners for hanging out with us this year, learning about the Lehigh University Department of Theater, and giving us a ton of support. It's been a really fun year, and we couldn't have done it without you.
We'd like to thank the Department of Theater for sponsoring this podcast and for having it be part of the Reboot the Future virtual production season, alongside so many other great productions, which we also encourage you to check out if you haven't.
While we aren't putting out any new episodes this summer, all of our past episodes are available on the Lehigh University Department of Theater YouTube channel, Spotify, and Google Podcast. Again, thank you all so much for being here with us. Have a great summer, and we'll catch you next time. Bye! The final one. For now.
Sad.
I know.
All I can think about now is Trevor being so confused that we were like dance partying the last time.
I know.
What's going on?
Do the people see the video? Yes, Trevor. Everyone sees it all the time. We're live streaming this whole podcast right
Did you
now.
not know?
We cut everything
Live. Right.
Okay.
Well, thank you.
I don't know if it's going to be a 45-minute episode, probably another hour one, but whatever.
We'll get it. We'll get it down to an hour.